Caroline. I was delighted when Caroline invited me to come speak. And I picked a date where I could go skiing in the nearby mountains, but as many of you know, as in California where I live, it's not ski weather. But there's something even more exciting about coming to Albuquerque that you will discover in the course of my talk that just makes me incredibly happy to be here. So I am very happy. And I'm going, surprise, you'll find out. And I'm going to be telling you about my life of adventures in the mountains and in molecules. I led the first American ascent, as you heard, of a mountain called Annapurna. And it's the first 8,000 meter peak that was ever climbed. There are about 15 mountains, 8,000 meters or higher. And when we climbed it, all the world's 8,000 meter peaks had been climbed by men, but no woman had climbed 8,000 meters. And I thought Annapurna, it's the first 8,000 meter peak climbed. Maybe it'll be the easiest. But guess which is the most dangerous of all the 8,000 meter peaks and has the highest fatality rate? Annapurna, and is possibly the hardest to climb. So it was really challenging, and I won't have time today to tell the story, but we did reach the summit. We were the first Americans and the first women. And a lot of the story I'm going to tell you about now, tonight, is about what I consider even harder than climbing Annapurna, and more dangerous and more important. And you're saying, what could be harder, more dangerous, and more important than the world's most dangerous mountain? And that is reducing the harmful and unnecessary chemicals that are in products that are around us every day. And that is the ascent that I've been on, and it's really to have healthy products and healthy buildings. And so I'm very happy to be sharing that with you. And as Caroline said, we send out newsletters either once a month or 4 times a year. So if you sign up, you can only hear from it. Everyone has too many emails, so we have a quarterly email too. But we like to keep people apprised. And so the title of my talk is about a theory we have on how you can have healthier buildings, people, and planet. So you might wonder, how did I look fairly ordinary? How did I end up leading that mountain climbing expedition and all that work with toxic chemicals? So it all started in my freshman chemistry lab. This is Reed College in the 60s, and my professor is that blonde young woman. She's 23 at the time. She had a PhD from MIT in chemistry, and she thought chemistry was the coolest thing on the planet. And there were 4 girls in my freshman chemistry lab, and we all got doctorates in chemistry, which was kind of unusual in the 60s. And my lab partner was this really handsome young man, and he said, "Do you want to climb Mount Hood one starry night?" And I said, "Sure." And we drove up to Mount Hood, and I was from Chicago. I'd never done anything physical in my life, and he put a big heavy pack on my back, and I started gasping. And he later said that I was gasping so loudly, oops, no, what did I do wrong? Let's see, I managed to turn, oh, there we go. Okay. I was gasping so loudly, didn't think I'd make it out of the parking lot, but he was very handsome, and so I got up there, and I think for some reason, let me just talk a little louder. So anyway, I kept doing chemistry and mountain climbing, and I was on a high peak in the Indian Himalayas with one of America's best young climbers, who was also an early environmentalist. And at the very summit, there was a cornice. That's where snow is over air. And he didn't know it was a cornice, and he stepped on the cornice and fell down a 5,000-foot vertical rock face to his death, which was horrible, and I was really depressed. And at that time, I was at Stanford being a postdoc studying how proteins fold, and I thought, how proteins fold isn't important. It actually is important, but I thought I want to do something worthwhile for the world. And on my orals committee at Berkeley was a guy named Bruce Ames, who had a rapid screening technique for whether a chemical was likely to be cancer-causing depending on whether or not it changed the DNA in bacteria, whether it mutated the bacteria. So I went to him and said, I'd like to do something for the health of the world. And he said, well, all the children in America are wearing these pajamas, and I think 10% of the weight of the fabric is this flame retardant, and it might get into the children, and I think it might cause cancer. Do you want to look at it? And I was like, it all sounded a little weird. He said, well, it's really important. Nobody wants to study it. It's too practical. Scientists in those days liked to do things that were theoretical. So I said I would, and we found a child who never worn the pajamas with the flame retardant, and the first day she wore the pajamas, there were cancer-causing flame retardant breakdown products in her urine. And so that meant that the chemicals were going from the pajamas into the child. So in America, chemicals that we eat, which is like foods, drugs, and pesticides, are, the government tries to make sure they're safe. You may not think they're well enough tested, but they are tested. But other chemicals like flame retardants, nobody really tests them. So we then did an analysis of the chemical, and we found that it did change DNA. It was a mutagen. It was likely to cause cancer. We said, oh no, most of the kids in the country are wearing this cancer-causing flame retardant in their pajamas that gets absorbed into their bodies. We need to tell all the parents of America. And then I got invited to Mount Everest. And at that point, all the world's high mountains of 8,000 meters or more had been climbed by men, and no woman had ever climbed to 8,000 meters, and no American woman had even tried Everest. Everest had only been climbed once by Americans. And so I had this terrible decision whether to go try to climb Mount Everest or tell the parents of America about the flame retardants in the pajamas. What would you do? Both, that's right. Whoever said that. Exactly, good answer. So I did go to Everest, and while I was hiking through the beautiful Khumbu icefall and putting ladders across big crevasses and climbing steep ice faces, I'd get to camp every night, and I'd work on my paper about the flame retardants in the kids' pajamas. And here's my high point at 24.5, and I have a flag, and the Petri dish with only the 2 plates that had no tris, not too many mutations, and the one that's blowing in the wind had tris with a lot of mutations. So we reached the summit. We were in 1976, the American Bicentennial Expedition, and I sent my paper by mail runner to Kathmandu, and it was published in Science magazine in early 1977. And the subtitle, "The main flame retardant in children's pajamas is a mutagen and should not be used." So that's unusual for scientists to say things that definitive. If any of you read scientific papers, they always conclude with the same suggestion. And what would that be? What's always what scientists?
More research is needed.
Exactly, more research is needed. And there we've done a couple of experiments, and we're telling everybody not to use flame retardants. And this is what our institute, the Green Science Policy Institute, does. We try to look at a lot of good science, do good research, and then use it in the public interest. So in those days, in January, we published our paper, and then 3 months later, the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission banned tris. That's how it should be, right? And so then brominated tris was banned, but when a chemical is banned or phased out, it's very expensive to change how manufacturers do things. And so the easiest thing is to substitute a very similar chemical, and similar chemicals tend to have similar health problems. So when chlorinated tris was phased out, and brominated tris was phased out, the replacement was chlorinated tris, and we went and looked at, did that change DNA? Was it likely to cause cancer? And the answer was yes. And so then we wrote another paper in Science, and chlorinated tris was phased out of pajamas. But what we didn't know is it continued to be used in furniture until about 2012, when it was listed as cancer-causing. So does anyone have a couch that you bought new between 2005 and 2012? So the odds are the foam in your couch is about 5% by weight chlorinated tris, the same chemical. And one thing you can do is go to a foam shop and swap out the cushion foam, because nowadays foam doesn't have flame retardants anymore, so people can do that. But on with my story. So after that, I led the Annapurna expedition that I mentioned and wrote this book, Annapurna, A Woman's Place. And I actually have several websites. One is just arleneblum.com, my name, and it's only about a month old. We've launched a brand new website with lots of pictures from my climbing expeditions, and also that's where my books and things are. So this is the arleneblum.com website. That I wrote a book called Annapurna. And then I spent nearly 20 years writing a book called Breaking Trail, trying to figure out how I got from my overprotected childhood on the south side of Chicago to leading the Annapurna expedition and all my work with toxic chemicals. And when I finished that book, my daughter was just starting college. I'd been writing it for 20 years. And I thought, I want to go back to doing science, but I haven't done it for 20 years. And I went to a scientific meeting with, there was one guy there, an industry guy from the foam industry, and he asked me what I did, and I said I used to study flame retardants. And he said, oh, flame retardants are a big problem because we used to have this great flame retardant called Penta we put in our foam till 2005, but then it got globally banned. So now we're putting in this flame retardant called chlorinated tris. And I said, chlorinated tris? That's what we got on kids' pajamas. He said it can't be the same thing, but it was. And then he said, well, why don't you come tell the chemical industry at our big annual meeting? And I said, well, you don't need me to tell the chemical industry. I've told you, you can tell them. He said, I can't tell them, they'll kill me. And I said, you want me to tell them? So I did go, and that was 11 years ago. And every day of this 11 years, I do feel like I'm on Annapurna, with avalanches and windstorms and yetis and crevasses and glaciers, only it's way more important because the summit that we're working to, and there's a whole team of people, some of them I met at lunch here in Albuquerque that might join our team. So it's really people from all over the world who want to make the world a better place, scientists and business people and government people and academics. So let me ask, though you probably already know the answer, how many of you think if a chemical is in your carpet or your building or your shampoo, someone's making sure it's safe for your health? Okay, not too many. Well, I asked this question in a talk I gave to 500 PhD chemists, and most of them thought the government was making sure that the chemicals they made were safe for their health. And you guys know more, and the answer is nobody really is. Foods, drugs, and pesticides are regulated, but other chemicals, and when things are out in the world, there's a Clean Air Act and a Clean Water Act, but once they're out there, you really can't bring them back. So they have one law, it's called TSCA, the U.S. Toxic Substances Control Act, and when it passed in the 70s, 62,000 chemicals were grandfathered, like you're okay forever, and that included brominated tris, chlorinated tris, asbestos, which kills about 10,000 people a year die from asbestos-related disease still, and the EPA tried for years to regulate it. They couldn't, so they stopped trying to regulate any of those 62,000 chemicals. New chemicals, there's no data required, so we really need to figure out what to do about this. Another big problem we call the regrettable substitution problem. On the left, you see a flame retardant, deca-10, bromine, diphenyl, those two rings, ether with that oxygen. Decabromo-diphenyl ether, it's persistent, it's bioaccumulative. That means as the little fish eat the bigger fish eat the littler fish, it just accumulates up the food chain. So marine mammals would have really high levels. It's toxic. After years of research and advocacy, it's being phased out. And as the sales of the ether go down on the left, the sales of ethane on the right. Does that look similar? Decabromo-diphenyl ethane. It has a carbon instead of an oxygen. And it is, surprise, persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. But we don't know that much about it yet. Take 10 more years. So that's called regrettable substitution, and there's always more regrettable substitutes. If any of you know about red lists, those are lists of chemicals you shouldn't use, but there's often a substitute that's very similar, with similar properties and similar adverse health effects. So a bunch of us who cared about this issue, actually first I'll say what our institute is. So the Green Science Policy Institute writes papers with an eye to changing policy and purchasing. The government can make changes through policy, but companies, big companies, retailers, manufacturers can change their purchasing and move the market way faster than the government. So we educate people, we have retreats, and we work for policy and purchasing change. We got together at a retreat in 2013 and said, you know, there's 80,000 chemicals out there. It takes years to get information on any of them. Does that sound discouraging? Like, what are we going to do? Just put our heads down and get poisoned? But we know there's certain classes or families where the chemicals are really likely to be problematic. And we know what they are. And we came up with 6 classes or families that contain a big majority of the harmful chemicals in everyday products. And then we made videos. These are 4-minute videos about each of the classes. And when you walk out, there's a pile of postcards. You can take a postcard with a picture like that. And it has the link to 6classes.org, and you can watch a 4-minute video and learn the basics about any of these classes of chemicals and ways that you can reduce your exposure and be healthier. So when a chemical is in these classes, we don't say ban it. You can't ban all 3,000 highly fluorinated chemicals, but you can say, is this chemical, well, maybe I should say what the classes are. They're highly fluorinated stain and water repellents. That includes Scotchgard and Teflon, the sort of slippery, sticky chemicals. They're antimicrobials like triclosan and triclocarban. They're flame retardants, bisphenols and phthalates, certain solvents, and certain metals. And when a chemical is in those classes, we say, is it necessary? If you say to a mom, you can have a great stain-resistant carpet, but the chemicals are going to end up in your children for years, and they cause health harm, and they're going to be on the planet forever, what is that mom going to say? Do I really need that stain-repellent carpet? Is it really worth it? Maybe instead of a white carpet, I'll have a gray carpet, and I won't have that bad chemical. And then if you really want that white carpet, then is there a safer alternative? Can we use green chemistry or biomimicry or find a way to have a safer chemical? So I'm going to talk today a bunch about the first 3 classes. And these classes, anybody remember their periodic table? So if you look over on the right, you see a blue circle around 3 elements: fluorine, chlorine, and bromine. And when you have fluorine, chlorine, or bromine bonded to carbon, it's a really strong bond. It doesn't break easily. And there are no naturally occurring molecules in any mammal that have that kind of molecule. And what that means is the systems in our body that keep toxics out, they don't see these molecules. They just creep in. And the systems that toss toxics out don't recognize them either. So they come into our bodies, they stay, and they cause problems. And they're all persistent. Many are bioaccumulative, many are toxic to humans. So we're going to start with my first favorite, highly fluorinated chemicals. And the names, they're called per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which is a mouthful. It's abbreviated PFAS. All this alphabet stuff is really confusing. But these molecules are really persistent. They stay around. They're literally called forever chemicals. One scientist said they last for geologic time. That's like 1 million years. So that fluorochemical to make your Gore-Tex jacket or your Teflon fry pan is going to be around 1 million years from now. Maybe, don't know about humanity 1 million years from now, but the fluorochemicals will be there. When you have what's called a long chain, you have like 8 or more carbons all surrounded by fluorine, they bioaccumulate, and they've been shown to be toxic. They're associated with 2 kinds of cancer, liver disease, immune system effects, thyroid disease, and other problems. And 2 of them are called PFOA and PFAS. So the C8s have been phased out. In 1965, DuPont, who made them, their scientists said, these are toxic, people shouldn't be exposed, but they neglected to tell their workers or the public. Then they were running these great ads on Better Living Through Chemistry, showing people dancing around with their Teflon fry pans. And so it took from 1965 to 2015. C8 was phased out in 2015 because it was extremely persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. And what is the replacement? C6. 6 carbons surrounded by fluorine. And it's being used by the outdoor industry to put on clothing, the fast food industry, you know, grease-proof paper, microwave popcorn. If you don't want that hot oil to go through the paper, you coat it with now C6. The military uses it for firefighting foams. And guess what? It's extremely persistent, never breaks down. It bioaccumulates in plants, and the C6s move faster. So they actually, if you have, say you have organic potting soil that has lots of fast food wrappers in it, it will also have PFAS. And if you plant things in it, the fruits and vegetables will have these chemicals in the fruits, not what you'd like to see. So they move faster than the long chains. So I went trekking in the Himalayas in 2013, and somebody said, take this great book along, and it was called Stain Resistant, Non-Stick, Waterproof, and Lethal. The Story of C8. Does that sound like a book you'd all like to read when you're trekking in Nepal? And it was an amazing book. It was it was written in 2007, and there was like no press coverage of this. It was a story of in the Ohio River Valley, there was a DuPont plant that through water and air polluted the whole DuPont river, the whole Ohio River Valley with C8. And in particular, one farmer, he worked at DuPont, but he was also a dairy farmer. He let DuPont use some of his land, they said, just to store things. And then his cows all got sick and started dying, and there was an investigation. They said he was bad animal husbandry, but he didn't think that was the reason. And nobody paid much attention to him. And so nothing much happened. This was 2013. Well, 2017, this year, the poet laureate of the US, Tracy Smith, wrote a poem called Watershed. And I'm sure you usually get to hear poems when you come to these talks. So I'm going to just read you the ominous beginning of Watershed. It's much longer. 200 cows, more than 600 hilly acres. Property would have been even larger had Jay not sold 66 acres to DuPont for wastes from its Washington Works factory where Jay was employed. Did not want to sell, but needed money. Poor health, mysterious ailments. What do you think happens next? Anyway, it's an epic poem that tells the story of but isn't it amazing to go from a story that had no media, that nobody paid any attention to having the US Poet Laureate writing a poem about it? And there's a film about it that I think won all these awards at the, what's the film festival in Utah that just happened? Sunset. Yeah, it's getting a lot of publicity on this story, which has this grainy footage that this farmer took. It's kind of horrific, of his dead cows and the water and the pollution. So this is really being discovered. And meanwhile, there have been legal claims against DuPont. So actually that farmer didn't know what to do, and he remembered there was somebody who'd come to his farm to work a couple summers who was now a lawyer in Cincinnati, a guy named Rob Billett. And Rob worked at a very conservative firm that usually represented the chemical industry. So the farmer called Rob, and Rob came down, and he couldn't believe what he found. And Rob's incredibly hardworking, and he started digging into all this, and he discovered the reason was what's called the Teflon toxin, this PFAS. And so he sued DuPont, and they won maybe $100,000, not a lot. And instead of giving it to the people who were harmed, they did a health study of, I think, 60,000 people in the Ohio River Valley. They collected blood samples, urine samples, medical histories, and that's where they discovered that the chemicals were associated with two kinds of cancer, high cholesterol. It was a study in the Ohio River Valley. And then he sued DuPont, and actually the suit started in 2010. But 2015, there were 3,000 personal injury and 37 wrongful death claims against DuPont. And a year ago, Rob actually came in February. I have a meeting. It was last Friday. He was at my meeting. And I always invite everybody to go hiking who comes to speak. And he gave his talk, which was wonderful, describing the whole story of the Ohio River Valley. And then he left abruptly and said, I'll explain why. And then he texted me, we got a $671 million settlement today. And I have to say, I nominated him for something called the Right Livelihood Award, which is like a Nobel Prize, like $500,000, and he got it this year. So very nice. Meanwhile, February 8th, 2018, every day, by the way, new things are happening. Like nothing happened for all these years, well, it's all happening. The Attorney General filed a lawsuit against DuPont for releasing toxic chemicals into Ohio. So it just happened. And what also happened is the state of Minnesota is suing 3M for $5 billion in damages that 3M, in pursuit of profit, deliberately disregarded the substantial risk of injury to the people and environment of Minnesota from its continued manufacture of PFCs or PFASs and its improper disposal. So every day there's something new like this happening. Like it's, you feel like the jig is up. It was silent for so long and it's not silent anymore. So one of our contributions is when I came back from that trek, I thought we always try to gather all the science. So I said, let's have a call every month with scientists who are studying this. And I thought we'd maybe get 5 or 6 scientists. So we have 80 scientists on our calls because everybody who studies these chemicals from all over the world knows how bad they are. And we have a bunch of EPA scientists. And some of the EPA scientists said, we did this testing of water districts all over the country, and there's really high levels of PFASs in a lot of the water districts. And somebody should be studying it, and we want to figure out where they're coming from. So I said, well, let's see as scientists if we can trace back, map, because we thought that they might be coming from military bases and airports where they use this kind of firefighting foam. So we got a bunch of scientists together, we wrote the paper and discovered it looked like they did come from military bases, airports, production facilities, and wastewater treatment plants. And as we were writing the paper, the New York Times did a cover story about Rob Billet, the cover of the New York Times Magazine. It was really good. And I wrote the author, it was such a good story, and I said, you should do more science writing. Do you want to subscribe to our newsletter, like I'm saying to all of you? And he said, I'm a novelist. I just wrote it because of the guy's character. I don't need to be on your newsletter. I hope you don't say that. But he said, this was just about a week after his article came out. He said, I have never had so many responses to anything I've ever written. Here's a letter from the governor of New York to the EPA demanding they set a health safety level. What is a safe level? We know there are all these high levels in drinking water. What's safe, what's not safe? So the EPA had been working on this safe level for about 10 years, and they finally published it. And they said the safe level, you can say, is 70 parts per trillion of this chemical. And when they set a safe level, we calculated, our paper wasn't finished, 6 million people's drinking water was above the safe level. And then everything changed, because when people discovered that their drinking water was above the health advisory level, they were really unhappy. The water they'd been drinking, putting formula for their kids, the value of their homes went down. Who wants to buy a home with unsafe drinking water? And so the drinking water health advisory level has been going down for a long time. DuPont had said 5,000 parts per trillion in '87, then 1,000 parts per trillion. The EPA had said 400 parts per trillion, then 70 parts per trillion was the recent number. But more recently, New Jersey has said 14 parts per trillion, and now Michigan has said 5 parts per trillion. So if you, oh yeah, and Michigan has a lot of problems, as you know, and one of the sad ones are the highly fluorinated hush puppies. So Wolverine used Scotchgard to treat their hush puppies starting in the 1950s, and they dumped the leather scraps, and the sludge was applied to fields, and then someone built a nice upscale suburb on those fields. And the levels they found were up to 58,000 parts per trillion. That's more than 800 times the health advisory level. And a lot of people in those suburbs had like the kinds of cancer that are associated with exposure. And this is being found all over the country, sites like this of industrial waste, of dumping, and the people who tested the water for the EPA went back, and if you look, the EPA estimate 1% of the drinking water supplies in the country are contaminated. But when they went and looked back, and how is Arizona doing in that math?
New Mexico, we're white.
New Mexico, white, good. Very good. Sorry, New Mexico, yeah. But in any case, they went back to find where there's contaminated water, and they estimate it's up to a quarter of the water supplies in the country will be found to be contaminated if you use that lower level of 5 parts per trillion. So this is, as I said, led to a lot of unhappy people. Another effort that we've done, another paper, was we went out around Berkeley and we took fast food wrappers from lots of organic co-ops and green places in Berkeley, and we tested them, and they had PFASs. Because nobody knows that they're on their food wrappers. And so we did a study of 400 fast food wrappers across the country, and about a third of them had PFASs. And they're used for organic compost, which means the fruit and vegetables contain PFASs. And this was the case, was after we did this, it got a lot of publicity. Maybe you heard about it. It was about a year ago. And we had a meeting where we informed the whole supply chain who makes fast food paper, and also some of the big fast food chains. And in the last year, they've all decided they want to get out of PFASs. So that's, you can provide information and really change things. Washington State has a ban on, is that out of order? Did I have the one? Well, I guess I missed that last one. But Washington State has 2 bans going on, and they both look like they're going to pass. They're going to ban all PFASs, the whole class. There are 3,000 of them. They're not just banning 1 or 2, but all of them in fast food wrapping paper and also in firefighting foam. And so that is taking the lead. Out of order, there's their bill on PFASs in fast food packaging. January 30th, South Australia bans all fluorinated firefighting foam for all applications. Something we're really working on here is the military requires fluorinated firefighting foams, and because of that, all civilian airports do too, which contaminates the drinking water around military and civilian airports. Another thing we're doing is we have a buyers club. All these companies want healthy workplaces for their employees, and they come together to share information, figure out what are healthier and safer products, building products. So this is all about workplaces. There's studies that people work more effectively if their workplace is healthy. And so Google, for example, really wants healthy workplaces, so does Facebook. And so we're working with them to think about whole classes, removing all antimicrobials, removing all PFASs from products. And based on that, many brands are eliminating all highly fluorinated chemicals. IKEA has done that, H&M, Crate & Barrel, Levi's. And they just remove the whole class. And that's much easier than consumers trying to keep track of all this. Yesterday, February 15th, huge news. California has a Safer Consumer Products department that lists products plus chemical combinations, and they've listed all carpets with any of the class of 3,000 PFASs as priority products for regulation. And that's big news because carpets are the #1 source of exposure for children to these chemicals they crawl on the carpets. And we're really happy. Last week we had a meeting with the major carpet manufacturers to explain to them the science, much like I'm explaining to you. And they started thinking, because they all switched from C8 to C6, and their line was C6 is perfectly safe. By the end of our meeting, they weren't so sure, and then they're all ready. They didn't know that this would come yesterday. So we hope if carpets stop using them, that would be great for everyone's health. So our second class is antimicrobials. Triclosan and triclocarban are commonly used in liquid soaps, bar soaps. And the fact is it's great to have bacteria on your hands. So you don't need antimicrobials on your hands. And for the antimicrobials to work, you have to wash your hands for about 2 minutes. Nobody washes their hands for 2 minutes. They wash their hands for 5 to 10 seconds. So the antimicrobials really don't do much good. But then they end up in our water supplies. They're not taken out in sewage treatment plants. And they're toxic for little creatures in the creeks, marine organisms. They get eaten by fish and bioaccumulate. There was a study that they end up in breast milk in places where we don't want them. So I won't go through all of this, but this is about triclosan, that antimicrobial. But an interesting story is, you see, in 1974, it says the FDA draft monograph on lack of efficacy and safety. So the FDA started to say they don't work and they're not safe in 74. And you can see in 2016, the FDA determined 19 antimicrobials not safe or effective in consumer soap. So it took 42 years, hard for the government. They did it in 2016. At the same time, when we did our webinar, we did these webinars on the different classes in 2013, and we did one on antimicrobials. And the day after, Target called and said, you know, we never knew we had triclosan in all our personal care products, and we're taking it out, and we're doing it immediately. So that's why we think working with companies, things can happen much faster, because companies can just decide they want to stop using things like IKEA or Levi's removing fluorinated chemicals. So now I'm going to talk about the chemicals that I've worked with the most, which are flame retardants. And back in the 70s, there were lots of fires. People thought flame retardants must be a good thing. And so they were put in, but removed from children's sleepwear in the 70s. I'll tell the story of how they were put into furniture and baby products and removed in 2014. And they were put into home building insulation, which has been a huge effort. But part of the reason I'm so excited to be here is we've been working on this for a decade, making almost no progress. We finally have made some progress, and the major hearing about all this is going to be here in Albuquerque. So I'm really excited about that. And at lunchtime, thanks to Jennifer back there from the AIA, I met some of the leading people on codes for the state of New Mexico who seemed really interested, and who knows, might help. So very wonderful. So if any of you have a couch, it's very likely your couch will have a label that says Technical Bulletin 117. That's a California standard for furniture, and pretty much the whole country follows California, but there's no fire safety benefit from this standard. And the sort of chemicals used to meet it are, this molecule on the top is PCB. PCBs are persistent, cancer-causing, and toxic. The next one is a flame retardant, and the one below it is a dioxin, which is persistent and toxic. So the flame retardant that was used from 1975 to 2004, if your couch was purchased in those years, 5% of the weight of your couch is probably that flame retardant. And as I said, you can replace the foam. The chemicals are always coming out of products, dropping into dust. You have some dust on your hand, you eat a sandwich, you eat some flame retardants. Cats, they lick their fur, they have higher levels. Sadly, toddlers who crawl in the dust and put their hands in their mouths, they can have levels that are 5 to 10, even 100 times higher than their parents. And that's not when you want to have flame retardants. The chemicals, there are literally thousands of papers about health harm in animal studies And now there's a number in people. Pregnant women, if they have higher levels, it takes them longer to get pregnant. And their children can have developmental problems, reproductive problems, lower IQ. So they're definitely problematic. There is no fire safety benefit. So is this a good idea to add flame retardants that have all those health problems and no fire safety benefit? Didn't seem like it. Oh, and they increase the toxicity of smoke more than they reduce fire growth. So they're not a great idea. And in California, we came up with the idea of changing the standard to increase fire safety without flame retardants, and it seemed like a great idea. And the furniture, foam, fabric industry, when they heard how toxic the chemicals were, they said, we don't want to expose our workers or the public, let's get them out. And scientists wanted them out, fire science, just everybody didn't want the chemicals in there. And so we tried to have 4 bills, but they weren't successful because Californians for fire safety. And who are Californians for fire safety? Albemarle, Chemtura, and Israel Chemicals Limited, the 3 manufacturers of flame retardants. And this is a deadly mistake. Don't let Sacramento politicians ban the use of proven flame retardants. It could be a deadly mistake. Anyway, this is a $7 million one-week campaign to stop a law that would increase fire safety without flame retardants. It would increase fire safety by stopping fires in the fabric, which is better than letting the fires reach the foam. So we heard the chemical industry had spent a total of $23 million. We had, just back here, we had 4 bills. They weren't successful. And then I invited the Chicago Tribune to come cover one of these crazy hearings where there'd be 3 lobbyists from the chemical industry lying, and all of our fine legislators would vote for them rather than the many doctors, scientists, community members, businesses that said we don't need flame retardants. So anyway, the subtitle to this article I think says it all. A deceptive campaign by industry brought toxic flame retardants into our homes and into our bodies, and the chemicals don't even work as promised. And it's a 4 full newspaper scandalous story. If you Google playing with fire, it's an amazing scandal. The flame retardant industry was really creative. And as you can see on the left, it won every environmental journalist prize, and it changed everything. And we have a new standard, TB 117-2013, where flame retardants aren't needed, and there's labels, little check boxes you can see. And if you go by a couch now, there'll be a label, and it will almost certainly be checked, contains no flame retardants. So that's pounds less toxic chemicals. They were also required in nursing pillows, high chairs, strollers, all these baby products, and they aren't anymore. So that is really a big deal and a very happy story. And so children's sleepwear and furniture were updated. And what about foam plastic building insulation? So as scientists, we wrote a paper on a case for reevaluating building codes. We showed that there was not a fire safety benefit. The flame retardants in insulation behind, so a thermal barrier wall, like in this building, has to resist 15 minutes of flashover fire. If it burns through the wall, there aren't too many people still alive in the building. Flashover is really hot, and a little bit of flame retardant, the insulation doesn't matter. What really matters is there an air gap. That big fire in England up that building, because there was an air gap, if there's an air gap, the fire travels. If the insulation is properly constructed with no air gap, the fire does not travel. And whether or not there are flame retardants in the insulation does not make a difference. If anyone's interested, I have some copies of the paper. If you sign the mailing list and say you want a copy, just write, send me the insulation paper, write insulation paper, we'll send it to you with the details. So what are the chemicals? The chemical that was used for a long time is called HBCD. It was used in polystyrene, that's EPS and XPS. It's bioaccumulative, toxic. It has since been banned in 160 countries. There's something called the Stockholm Convention, and only 23 chemicals have been banned globally, and this is one of them. And so it has been replaced now, but old construction, if you're remodeling, if you're demolition, all XPS, EPS polystyrene is very likely to contain HBCD. And it was always surprising to me, you could go to green building meetings and there'd be these samples of EPS and XPS as though they were environmental things and no sign saying they were toxic and you shouldn't touch them or saw them. So what's the replacement? Do you think it's going to be good?
No.
So the replacement is called PolyFR, and the 3 companies make it. They call it Emerald Innovation, Green Crest. Do you believe it's green? So what it is butadiene is a carcinogen, styrene is a carcinogen. You take butadiene and styrene and you mix them and add bromine. Does that sound good? But if you call it Emerald Innovation, when I started working on this project, the Emerald 3000, I called it the yellow brick road. You have to set forth on the yellow brick road to vanquish Emerald 3000. So that is what we currently have. The chemical industry has assured us it's much better. It's probably the #1 flame retardant. It is a polymer, a big molecule, so it's less likely to get into people. But there's still a whole life cycle to think about. The manufacturing of the chemical, the product, the installation, when it's used, demolition, and then recycling and reuse. So the planet doesn't really need this if it doesn't provide a fire safety benefit. There are safer alternatives, but they're often more expensive. They don't have the same R value. Alternatives aren't always feasible, like the Living Building Challenge has exceptions where you can use these flame retardants, for example, below grade, but below a slab where there's no oxygen and no fuel source. Countries like Sweden and Norway have updated their building codes back in 2001, 2004 to allow foam plastic without flame retardants, and indeed 97% of the plastic insulation does not contain flame retardants, and they haven't been having any fires, like maybe it's not needed. So we had a bill in California to say you didn't have to use flame retardants, and it had huge opposition from the chemical industry. We finally just said below grade, below the slab, let's try that. And the bill said that the fire marshal could propose updates to maintain fire safety, but provide flexibility in meeting the standards with or without flame retardants. So there was a study at Oklahoma State University, and they found that foam plastic with and without flame retardants ignited in a similar amount of time, gave off a similar amount of heat. There wasn't a risk of fire spread. It said that California codes could be updated to allow below-grade insulation without flame retardants. Our fire marshal is going to recommend to our building council that California do this. And then the next question is, and we have all these supporters, many architectural firms, companies who want healthy workplaces. We have tried, there's code committee hearings once a year, and we've tried since 2015 to change the code unsuccessfully. But now we're optimistic with California doing it. And guess where the next code committee hearing meeting is? Albuquerque. And the reason that is so awesome is these hearings go on for 5 days. And so normally, like the senior vice president of sustainability of Kaiser Permanente came to the code hearing, but could only stay 3 days and didn't get to testify. And you only get to testify for 2 minutes. So you see an advantage if you live in Albuquerque. And so I was hoping to meet people who might be interested in this while I was here. So if any of you are, the 2019 code hearing will be here, and we ask your help. Please sign our mailing list if, say, you want to help to maybe participate in the code hearings or give us input, and it's just below grade that we're considering. So again, for monthly newsletters, please sign up. You can ask me questions, just Arlene at greensciencepolicy.org, And I'll just end by saying that I think by limiting the use of these 6 classes, just now that if there's a big potential for harm, don't use these chemicals, use others. And I think doing that, we can all have a much healthier world. So thank you.